thrust, delivering 930,000 pounds of thrust from its 4 boosters and single engine.
Before the world watched the Challenger explode on live television, before NASA learned how fragile spaceflight could be, another crew had already paid the ultimate price in silence. Their names were Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev, 3 cosmonauts who walked toward their Soyuz spacecraft in the summer of 1971, believing they were about to make history, and they did.
Liftoff of the Soyuz MS-10 to the International Space Station, carrying Nick Hague and Alexei Ovchinin to the orbital complex.
Just not in the way anyone hoped. Soyuz 11 was supposed to be the Soviet Union's greatest triumph, the mission that would prove they were years ahead of the United States in the race to build and inhabit the first space station. They had Salyut 1 already waiting in orbit, gleaming like a promise against the darkness. What they needed was a crew brave enough and skilled enough to live inside it. The original team chosen to fly this mission had trained for months, but 4 days before launch, a routine X-ray revealed a medical shadow on one cosmonaut's lungs. Tuberculosis was suspected. Whether the diagnosis was real or politically convenient, the result was the same. The entire crew was removed and replaced. 3 new men, 2 of them first-timers, were told to get ready. They had only days to prepare for a mission that could define a generation. On June 6, 1971, at 4:55 in the morning, Soyuz 11 blasted off from Baikonur Cosmodrome. The rocket shook the ground beneath it, flames cutting through the pre-dawn air, carrying with it the hopes of a country obsessed with proving its superiority in the cosmos. The spacecraft's call sign was Yantar, Amber, and for the first few hours, everything was smooth. After all, docking with Salyut 1 wasn't guaranteed to work. Soyuz 10 had tried months earlier and failed, leaving the station empty and waiting. But this time, the approach went perfectly. The computers took over at 7 kilometers out, closed the distance, slowed the speed, and held steady until the ships drifted together like puzzle pieces. A few mechanical locks, a pressure check, and then the hatch opened. For the first time in human history, people walked into a space station and immediately smelled smoke. Salyut 1 had been orbiting for weeks without visitors, and something in its ventilation system had burned. The air tasted metallic and harsh. Instead of celebrating, the crew had to evacuate back to their Soyuz, seal the hatch, and wait for the station to clear. Their grand moment began with a chemical sting in their lungs, but they fixed it. They entered again, this time breathing easier, and finally began the mission the world had been waiting for. For 22 days, they lived in Salyut 1. The longest anyone had ever stayed in space. They filmed broadcasts for Soviet television. They ran experiments around the clock. They exercised on a treadmill that shook the entire station so violently that Mission Control asked if it was safe. They even survived a small fire that flared up on day 11, filling the tight metal walls with panic and smoke until they got it under control. The highlight of the mission was supposed to be observing the launch of the massive N-1 moon rocket, the Soviet answer to the Saturn V, but the launch kept getting delayed. Still, the mission was a success on paper. They had proven humans could stay in space for weeks, work, live, sleep, and endure. Yet none of it mattered compared to what happened next. On June 29th, they packed up samples, data, tapes, and personal items, transferring everything from the station back into Soyuz 11. They closed the hatch behind them, leaving Salyut 1 empty once again. At 1828 GMT, they undocked and started drifting away, preparing for the journey home. The final checks were routine. The retro engines fired at 22:35 GMT, slowing the craft to descend toward Earth. At 22:47, the modules separated: the orbital module, the service module, and the descent capsule that held the crew. And then silence. Mission Control expected brief radio dropout. The ionosphere always swallowed the signal at a certain point, but this silence felt different. It came too early, too sudden, too complete. Still, the capsule landed exactly where it was supposed to, gently, almost perfectly, in the quiet plains of Kazakhstan. Recovery crews rushed in, eager to greet the heroes who had set endurance records and conquered the first space station. They knocked on the hull, no answer. When they opened the hatch, the scene inside was chilling. All 3 men were strapped in their seats exactly as they should have been. No alarms, no signs of fire, no signs of a crash, just still bodies with blue faces, dried blood around their noses and ears, and no pulse. One rescuer said Dobrovolsky's body was still warm. They tried CPR, they tried everything they knew, but it was too late. All three were dead. The Soyuz 11 crew became the only human beings in history to die in space. Not in the atmosphere, not during launch, not during landing, but in the silent vacuum itself. What killed them was terrifyingly simple. A valve, a tiny breathing ventilation valve meant to equalize pressure after landing, had been violently jarred open during module separation. Inside the Soyuz were explosive bolts designed to fire in sequence, one after another. Instead, they fired at the same moment, a fraction of a second glitch that created a force strong enough to shake the valve loose. It opened at 168 kilometers above Earth, far above breathable air, and within seconds, the entire cabin depressurized. In less than a minute, the crew was gone. Patsayev, the research engineer, was found slumped near the valve, his hands close enough to suggest he tried to close it with the last flickers of consciousness. But once the pressure dropped, no human could survive more than 20-30 seconds before blackout. Cardiac arrest registers at around 40 seconds. Their bodies showed the unmistakable signs of vacuum exposure, ruptured blood vessels, bleeding in the inner ears, nitrogen bubbling in the bloodstream, lactic acid flooding their tissues as their cells suffocated. The horror lasted under a minute, and then everything was still. The Soviet Union didn't tell the world the truth, not at first. They celebrated the mission's successes in newspapers. They praised the heroism of the crew. They held a massive funeral at Red Square and gave the cosmonauts the highest honor, Hero of the Soviet Union, but they refused to release the cause of death for almost 2 years. NASA, preparing for the Skylab program, was terrified. If microgravity itself was killing astronauts, then long-duration spaceflight was a death sentence. But American doctors insisted otherwise. Eventually, the truth came out. Not space, but engineering. A single valve, a fraction of a second, 3 lives gone. The redesign that followed changed spaceflight permanently. From that moment on, Soyuz ships carried only 2 cosmonauts instead of 3, leaving room for each to wear a pressure suit during launch and landing. The Sokol suit was light, flexible, and not meant for spacewalking, only survival. Versions of that same suit are still used today. Every astronaut who rides a Soyuz owes their safety to the men who died in Soyuz 11. The site where the capsule landed still exists, a lonely patch of land surrounded by grass and sky. A monument once stood there, vandalized over the years, rebuilt by Roscosmos in 2013, its 3 faces pointing in 3 directions like silent guardians of a story the world almost forgot. The crew's names were carved onto the moon by the Apollo 15 astronauts, who placed a small memorial called the Fallen Astronaut there. Even Pluto carries a tribute, Soyuz Koles, a group of hills named in their honor. Across the sky, their legacy is etched into stone and craters and stories whispered in every space program on Earth. Yet the most haunting part of the Soyuz 11 tragedy isn't the valve, or the silence, or even the discovery of the bodies. It's the image of their capsule sitting perfectly upright in the open Kazakh grass. A flawless landing containing a terrible truth. A successful mission with no survivors. A spacecraft that worked everywhere except where it mattered most. A historical milestone overshadowed by the cost of reaching it. Long before Challenger broke apart in front of millions. Before Columbia disintegrated over Texas. Before spaceflight became synonymous with televised heartbreak. Soyuz 11 taught the world a brutal lesson. Space does not forgive mistakes. It does not warn you. It does not pause for human error. Up there, the smallest flaw becomes a catastrophe. Up there, silence can mean anything except safety. And Soyuz 11 remains the quietest disaster the world has ever seen.